Well, this is the review of the Canon R8 and what I think of it as an A camera or a B camera. And today I got it paired with the 500 f4 1.4 teleconverter because I ran across some snow buntings out here today. And this is not really the weather I expected to see. Like I said, in middle of April, it is snowing quite heavily right now. So I'm doing snow buntings in the snow. And I just now lost them, so I got to go reacquire them. Some cars came by and spooked them out. So let's go see if we can find them and talk a little bit more about this camera. So let's talk a little bit about the setup. We're going to be running on this Canon R8, how I'm going to be running it for these tests, and how I'm going to be reviewing it. The first thing is I'm probably going to run in this 500 f4 most of the time. I know most of you don't have this lens, but that's what I'm going to be running. And I'm also be running the battery grip of this guy for this review. So if you're going to run this for wildlife photography for your A or your B cam, I would say definitely get this battery grip. The reason is you're going to double your battery life, and the camera feels a little more stable in the hand. Got a little bit of a break in the weather here, so I'm checking for ptarmigan up here, because the reason I started coming up here when I found those snow buntings. But pretty nice. It was fun shooting those snow buntings, and what's funny is the weather that I had was actually down below me right now. It's actually trying to push up and come in my way, so I'll have snow here in a bit. But again, those snow buntings were really fun to photograph. I don't get them a lot up here because they usually are too far away. They're such a small bird, but I got lucky and they're close to the road, and I could kind of sneak up on them and get some pictures. Probably not greatest pictures in the world because the light was really bad down there, but up here higher in the mountain, I've got above the clouds a little bit, or just beside the clouds. But anyway, that's how I'm having this camera set up. 500 f4 battery grip. If you do buy this camera, I advise you to buy the battery grip. You're going to double your battery life. And again, the camera feels so much better. So I think what I'm doing now, I think I know where some swans are, because I'm not seeing any ptarmigan. I'm not hearing them up here either. I was hoping to find them because they should be changing colors right now, getting more mottled heads. I think I know where some swans are at. We'll go down there. It's going to be snowing over there because I can see that whole area is dark gray, that direction where the swans are. And it's going to be cold. It's cold up here too, but we're going to go down there and see what we can get for these swans and see what kind of pictures to do. We'll talk a little bit about this camera and what I think about it and how it's working. Right now, it reminds me so much of the R6 Mark II and its functionality. As far as the IBIS, I'm not bothered missing that because the lens, this lens has, and all our wildlife lenses have IS in them. So not having IBIS in this body is not an issue to me. Again, IBIS is only going to help you with video more than stills, because remember, the stop you get in a picture, when you want to stop the wings, you want to stop the motion, or even get blur, is by your shutter speed, not the IBIS or the IS in the lens of the body. It's just going to help you a little bit more in the pan and the up and down, but it's not really going to help you in the stop. Remember, that's coming from your shutter speed. So let's run down and see if we can find those swans and test this body a little bit more and tell you more what I think of the Canon R8. Talk to you here in a bit. Boy, that was a lot of fun photographing those swans. The light was a little tricky on these swans because I had to go to the backside of the lagoon, walk all the way around to get close enough to shoot them, which meant they were backlit the whole time. I was really hoping that sun was going to burn off that little bit of haze there and to give you some gold light behind it, but it never happened. So I had this weird blue-gray light on them the whole time. So exposure was really tricky because I had that horrible little gray bluish light on them the whole time. So I had to either overexpose it or way underexpose it. So it was really tricky, but it was still a lot of fun photographing those swans. Now we got that out of the way, let's actually get into the actual review of this camera. The first part of this video is pretty much what you can expect to get out of the video, the stills, and where the AF points for tracking and all that, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. We're going to review this with the grip only. With the grip off, this camera feels too small in the hand. So does the R6 Mark II and the R5. I have battery grips on those if I use them also. But once you put the battery grip on this camera feels 100 times better because you have plenty of room for your hand here. And what's even better is with this battery grip being $57 for starters instead of $350 like the Canon ones are, this is still lighter than the R6 Mark II by like 4 ounces and about a ½ pound lighter than the Canon R5 without battery grips, with this one being in here. So this is a good hike and run around camera, which is really nice, the weight that is. 1½ pounds, a little less than that. The button layout, love it, just same as the R6 Mark II. You got your on-off switch over here and lock, and you've got your video to stills button on this side. Top button layouts just like the R6 Mark II, the R5, and the R6, which I love because I've basically got I can set my shutter, my ISO, and then of course for me, for aperture, I just set it with the Q button on the back. So onto the front, there's no depth of field button on the front like a lot of the other cameras have. It only has the lens release button on here. Side of the camera, just like all the other Canon cameras, we actually even have a microphone and a headphone out. Like the R10 does not have the headphone out, but this one does. So I was expecting not to see that in this camera, but I have it. As far as the back of the camera, we've talked about this before in previous videos, but there's no joystick on here, which I don't care about. I can control that by the corner of the screen, or I can control it by the D-pad. We don't have a rate button or a magnification button. Again, both those things I don't care about. I do all that in post, right? For the magnification, I hit the back of the screen and pinch it when I review the images, so not a big deal there. Yes, no dial, and instead we have a D-pad. Again, I've gotten used to this on the R7, the R10, all those cameras, so it's not a big deal to me. Actually, you can assign more to this D-pad you can with the dial on the back of the camera. But for all that, this camera, like I said, with the battery grip feels really good. Moving on to the LCD. This LCD is exactly the same as the R6, the R6 Mark II, and the R8. The LCDs on Canon cameras are fantastic. You can rotate them around, spin them around, all that good stuff. The camera also has a hot shoe on top where you can put microphones and things like that will communicate with it. You have your diopter on the side like all your other cameras have over here. So if you look through it and you got focus and it's still fuzzy, just change that diopter. It's kind of like going to the doctor when he does your glasses. So it works really good too. So on this side of the camera, you don't have the card door like you normally have when you put your SD cards. And another thing about this camera, it has 1 card slot instead of 2 card slots. To me, I really don't care about that because I don't shoot redundant anyway. I only shoot single cards, so 1 card doesn't bother me very much. With that brings us to the battery, which was another con some people had. This only has that smaller LPE 17 battery in it, which is about half the amp hours as the LPE 6N, which is the R6 has, and the R6 II, and the R7, the R5, all those cameras. But again, you can get around that by using this battery grip. Now you got 2 batteries in here. Now you're back to like a full-size battery. What I've noticed using this, I used it for about 4 hours out in the cold and the snow and the swans, and I only burnt through one of these batteries now. I probably had about 2 hours plus, or 2.5 hours on this card because I kept turning the camera on and off between when the swans were sleeping and when they were awake. So that's pretty good going through 1 battery here, which is half of this thing. So I think this thing would probably last you almost a full day on the batteries. But I would say probably own 4 of those batteries if you can, at least 3. 2 is a bare minimum on this camera, and use the grip. So on to the EVF. As you look through here, the EVF is great, works exactly what I would want it to. I know it's a lower dot, like 2.3, 2.6, somewhere in there, million dots. But that you can see everything through that viewfinder. You can see your subject, you can see everything about your subject, you can see your exposure, you can see all the little info you have in your screen, your histogram, all your exposure, your aperture, your shutter, you can see all that well in here, and you can still see your subject. You can see it well. You can tell if you've got good exposure or not. So the EVF on this passes muster for me. It works really good. So another thing about these batteries too, by what I talked about with the Swans, I'll use one of those batteries. I'm also pushing that big 500 f4 lens, so I'm pushing a bigger motor that's pushing out of this for battery. So I really expected that battery to go down a lot faster pushing that big lens. So these batteries, whatever they got set in here, is working pretty good for battery life. I mean, yes, it'd be better to have the bigger battery, but that would not have fit in this camera for them, the smaller body size. But yeah, it really surprised me. I expected to have a lot more battery drain out of that big lens than I did during the day. So now onto the guts of this guy. Let's talk about the autofocus. The autofocus on this thing is fantastic. Same as the R6 Mark II, and a trickle down from the R3. It's even better than the R7. And out of all the cameras I've tested so far, Nikon Z9, which is the most advanced of theirs, the A7R5 is supposed to be the most advanced Sony autofocus. I still need to test the A1, so I can't speak to that. Even the Canon cameras, this is still the best autofocus, the quickest to acquire and staying on a subject, and having to set very little up to just hit the button and grab it throughout the whole frame. Works fantastic. And you can see it in all the footage that I've shot so far with how sticky is the eye, even in video. How I'll have a swan's head up and turn his head, it'll drop off the eye. Got one laying down with barely an eye showing under its wing, and it grabs the eye. Just fantastic in video. So the autofocus in the video, killer. Just love it. The autofocus in stills, also killer. Sticks. Bird in flight, grabs it no problem. It grabbed a little bitty snow bunting, about that big, flying way away from me, and just nailed it. Didn't have my shutter speed exactly as fast as I need, but it locked focus the whole time. It really surprised me. Really quick, just jumping the camera up and hitting it. So the autofocus is phenomenal on this camera. Let's talk about the megapixels of this camera. So at 24 megapixels, I've always said that's a little low for wildlife photography. Now, you've got to remember the 1DX Mark IIs and 3s, they had 20 megapixels, and those were the wildlife cameras. So you can do it with that. What you have to watch for is how many megapixels you're putting on your subject. So the farther out it is, and the smaller it is in frame, you're going to have less megapixels on your bird. So the more you can enlarge that in the frame, the better. So if you get this about a quarter or more in the frame, it's going to look fantastic on this camera. So yes, it is low, but again, for me, this is my C and maybe a B camera at times, or maybe a travel camera because it is so light. And it's mainly going to be my video camera for in the studio. With those 24 megapixels, a lot of you guys are shooting the R6 Mark II on a lot of birds and a lot of stuff like that, wildlife, so you know you can do it. I'd prefer you guys to have 45 megapixels or 50, but 24 will suffice for a B camera, C camera for me. Other people, it will work for an A camera because you're getting closer to your subjects. That being said, image quality. Image quality on this thing is fantastic. Like I said, exact same sensor as the R6 Mark II. Nothing different there. That part, most of the guts in this guy is the exact same as the R6 Mark II. And the image quality is out of this world. It's great. I love it. Some people maybe talk about the dynamic range not being as great, but you know what? Expose correctly, get your shots right. If you need to focus, stacker, so exposure, bracket something, do that. If you need your sky and that, just exposure bracket it, layer your shots together. But I like what's coming out of this camera. It's taking really good shots, really good images, and I've shot it, like I said, with the buntings and the swans. I shot it in horrible conditions, and that I could get usable image on it because the lighting and the snow and everything was horrible, but it worked. Even the snow, it was locking on the autofocus on the bird. But so yeah, the image quality of this guy is really, really good. So let's talk about the sensor and the shutter on this guy. So we'll talk about the sensor for a second first, because that's going to go into the shutter, what things I'm going to talk about. So the sensor on this thing is extremely fast. It's about 14.5 milliseconds. It's faster than the R5, but not as fast as the R3. Of course, the R3 is about 4.5, I think, milliseconds. But that's really, really fast. That's fast enough to freeze most action on this camera at 40 frames a second, which is really, really nice. So that faster shutter speed is great. Now, if you whip pan hard on this thing, you're going to see a little bit of bend. You won't see any break or bow, but you will see bend in the trees if you really whip pan it hard. If you have something move really fast, sometimes you'll see a little bit of bow, but this thing is much, much better than the R5 and phenomenally better than the R7, of course. So the rolling shutter is not as big on this camera, is what I'm getting at, which leads us to our shutter speeds. So this guy does not have a mechanical shutter, which means there's no door on here. So if you open this up and you look inside, you will see the sensor. So what I suggest you do is when you're changing out your lenses, you set this thing facing down, take this off, put your lens on, and then you're good. Try not to do it with it facing up because stuff could fall inside the camera. With that being said, the electronic first curtain it does have, it's 6 frames a second. And the only time you're going to run that is if you are whip panning or you are seeing really crazy bow in your wings or something, or a racket or a baseball bat or something like that. But that's going to be very, very seldom that would happen. And then you may use a 6 frames a second, which is fine. Most of the time for wildlife photographers, we'll be shooting 40 and 20 frames a second on this guy because we want to shoot the fast as we can, which leads us to talking about the buffer. And when do I want to use 20, when do I use 40? So the buffer on this guy is about a little over at 40 frames a second, just a little over a second, not quite a second and a half, not quite just a second, somewhere in between there. And you can get about 52 shots out of this guy before it hits the buffer, and then you're done. At 20 frames a second, you can get 63 frames out of this guy before it hits the buffer. And again, just like the R7, you want to, either one of those, you want to feather them. So with the 40 frames a second, you got to get on and off that thing pretty quick. And it'll offload really quick to a V90 card. Now get a V90 card for these. Whew, snowfell scared me over there. But one thing you want to do on these cameras is feather that shutter at 40 or 20 frames a second. So you want to be less than a second every time at 40 frames a second and keep feathering that guy. And at 20 frames a second, you can hold it down for about a second and a half and then get back on it. You can get back on this really fast if you have a V90 card in here. I would suggest you get V90 cards so you can shoot those higher frame rates and so you can get those pictures out of that buffer onto the card and get the next shot going. But one bit of advice I'd give you about 40 frames to 20 frames a second is when I was shooting swans or other things, shooting 40 frames a second, I've got a lot of things with the exact same, no different movement. Even though the swan's flapping its wings, there's like no movement there. Every once in a while I get movement. I would keep this thing in 20 frames a second for your general shooting needs. That way you don't have like a still animal or an animal's not moving a lot and you're not getting a lot of dead shots you have to cull through later. Because after I got into the swans, I had about 3,000 pictures on this guy. So really, really rough on that. So what I would do is I've been setting this thing to 20 frames a second, and when I need to change it, I change in the viewfinder to 40 frames from H plus to H and back and forth in the viewfinder when I need to change between those methods. If I see something happen fast, I hit it 40, and then I got my 40 frames a second. And you'll hit that buffer a lot if you're not real careful at 40 frames a second. It's really easy to do on this camera. So again, this camera has all the same settings and features, the R7 and the R6 Mark II. So if you've got either one of those cameras, you're going to have all the same settings in here. Sorry, I keep wiping my face. There's a few little bugs flying around here at this time of year, even though I got a ton of snow. And I'm in a beautiful location here. I'm at Whittier, and that's Blackstone Bay behind me. Just gorgeous. Got waterfalls on both sides of me, just tranquil. Still a ton of snow here too. So with those same menus, you're going to have the same thing. You're going to have focus bracket. You can have the raw burst mode where you get the 15 frames before you hit the shutter type things. You also have focus stacking in this camera, so if you shoot macro or things like that. So it has all those same settings, all those same features, all the same drive modes. It's just that this will shoot 40 and the R7 will shoot 30, but it'll be the exact same as the R6 Mark II. So most of your internals are just exactly the same, so it's really fun. The raw burst mode is a lot of fun. We got birds taking off and landing, so that's the only one I really used in the past. I've done the R7. I have a whole video on that, and go watch that R7 video about the raw burst mode, tell you all about it. It's exactly the same as this camera is. My experience so far with this guy with stills has been fantastic. I've been able to capture anything I do because the autofocus is phenomenal on this thing. The image quality is great. I haven't had any problem with the viewfinder with that. So the stills experience on this guy I feel really good. One of the things I've noticed is I keep forgetting this is an R8, a lower level camera, because it feels good with this grip. And it just captures and does what I want it to do. It's a real welcome sight. I've been running the Z9 so much, and I've been running that A7R5, and I was doing the review for that. And coming back to a Canon camera, the Canon Autofocus was just a delight. It's just so easy to use. For video, this thing is fantastic. I love this guy for video, and that's one of the biggest reasons I picked it up, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to pick up the R6 Mark II. Was because I could shoot 180 frames a second and uncropped, which is great on this camera. 120 is awesome, but 180 is even better. And I needed that camera in the studio also to leave this camera more, and then have a travel camera too that I wasn't worried about tearing up when I don't want to take the R7, when I want more of a full frame type scenario in my images. But the video on this is fantastic. That 180 frames a second, really slowing those animals down, and I can have a lot more range where I can speed up or slow down by going to 180 frames a second. Just fantastic. The autofocus in the video, just tack sharp. I love it. So I've mentioned a lot of things I like about this camera. What are things I don't like about this camera? Well, to be honest with you, there's only one thing on this camera that I just don't like. Everything else I like. It's where the AF on button is. It's too far to the right. When I have gloves on, it's hard to get to. It's kind of hard for me to find it. But without my gloves on, not a big deal. Other than that, everything else on this camera, I love it. It's really nice. And it's the reason I went to this camera instead of the R6 Mark II, to save about $1,000, actually $1,300 when you're said and done with the battery grip. Well, guys, that's it. This camera is a fantastic little camera to me. I think it's worth saving $1,300 to go with this one over the R6 Mark II, and that's what I did for my needs. If you guys like this video and you're liking the channel, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And until next time, you guys get out there and run that shutter.